Hello, and welcome to the Narrowing Path, Walking the Spirit's Walk. My name is Stephen Eierstein, and thank you for joining us for another episode of this podcast. I appreciate everyone that's been jumping on, that's been listening, either through Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or even Amazon Music I'm on now, and this YouTube channel. I really appreciate it. Don't be shy. Give us a like. Give us a subscribe. I'd really like to be able to continue to grow this message and be getting it out there. So, but I appreciate all the support and everybody that is taking the time to listen in. So I am excited to introduce a new author to this channel. So far, I've only done James Allen. I almost said the new one. I did an entire year of James Allen meditations. I just finished the review of James Allen's book, As a Man Thinketh, which was a very influential book in my personal life, in my spiritual life, and in my life of recovery. And James Allen's As a Man Thinketh has been identified as one of the premier and beginning books of self-help, and it was certainly something that helped me along my way. And I'm excited to introduce the next book that I was shown and given a copy of to read, which is right here. And I know I've said his name before in the book title, but it is Emmet Fox's Sermon on the Mount. An incredible book, read by many for many different reasons, particularly popular in the New Thought movement of the early 1900s, late 1800s, and also in the world of recovery, whether it be from substances or alcohol, to eating disorders, to gambling addiction, to Debtors Anonymous, to whatever it might be, right? So the Sermon on the Mount has some fundamental principles that have been woven into the fabric of recovery. The founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, which really inspired the rest of the 12-step programs, would go and listen to Emmet Fox's speeches regularly. They took a lot of inspiration from him. And yeah, so it's a fantastic book. This is the copy I'm going to be reading out of. This copy is from 1938. It was originally copyrighted in 1934. Fantastic book, though. And I like to get the books, again, as close to the original as I can, or initial release as I can within reason, to make sure what I'm reading is accurate. There's been a lot of reprints of a lot of these books, and sometimes they're not reprinted properly. I referenced it in the As a Man Thinketh last chapter. It can be a word that is changed on reprint to a different spelling, but that spelling difference makes an entire world of difference. So it's something to keep in mind. And excuse the beeping in the background. And I plan on going forward and doing it this way. So I should first say I'm not going to read this entire book on this podcast, at least not at this moment. The first thing I'm going to actually address is the beatitudes chapter. Okay, so the book title itself is called Sermon on the Mount by Emmet Fox. Okay, there's the original dust jacket for this one, the orange right there. I've got a couple other copies. These are also all four of these are also Sermon on the Mount copies, early 1930s. except for this bottom one. That's the most recent reprint. Anyway, doesn't matter that much. So, there's a first chapter in this book titled, What Did Jesus Teach? Right? In the actual, he talks about the mission of Jesus. Now, I should preface this as well to say there's going to be a lot more God talk and a lot more Jesus and Christ references as we go through this book. And I know that will rub some the wrong way, but I believe if you can see principle behind your perception, this book can provide a lot of growth and understanding and perspective. And it's honestly the first beatitude addresses these things. So I'm looking forward to it. But I'm not going to read the first chapter. We're going to go right to the Beatitudes, which is chapter 2, okay? And I'm going to actually start with the first Beatitude. There's a little bit of an introduction kind of talking about this. And the Beatitudes come from Matthew chapter 5. This is where the book title comes from. Matthew's account of Jesus Christ's Sermon on the Mount. Okay, and that's where he mentions the Beatitudes and all of these things. So, and that's where we're going to start. And I'm going to go to the first Beatitude. There's like a page and a half of writing before the first Beatitude, but I really just wanted to cover this part of it. The intro to this chapter is really the part I'm not going to read. Is just to give a recap. He talks about how Jesus spoke on principle, not on necessarily tradition. And that was something very different. It wasn't about do these specific practices. It wasn't dogma. It wasn't religious practices. It was spiritual principle is what Jesus taught. And that set him apart from the teachings and the spiritual leaders and religious leaders of the time. And that contradicted what was primarily being taught, that it was that salvation or favor with God or any idea similar to that was achieved through ritualistic practices where boxes are checked and then you appease this God that was previously conceived. And Jesus more so taught on principle and was almost anti-ritualistic. It was how you are living, not become obsessed with certain ritualistic practices and those determinations. So that was the part I'm not going to read. I'm going to go through and I'm going to read I think there's 8 of them we're going to be going through. And I'm going to read the Beatitude. Some people say beatitude. To each their own. I've said it both ways. I'm going to call it beatitude. On this podcast, ridicule me if you like. That's okay. And I'm going to read it through, and then I'll give some of my thoughts and my understandings of it, and then we'll move on to the next one next week. So here we go. This is the first beatitude in Emmet Fox's Sermon on the Mount that he's speaking in chapter 2 about, which is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Here we go. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here, in the very beginning, we have to take into account a point of great practical importance in the study of the Bible, namely, that it is written in a peculiar idiom of its own, and that terms and expressions and sometimes actual words are used in the Bible in a sense that is distinctly different from that of everyday usage. This is quite apart from the fact, for which we have also to be on the lookout, that certain English words have changed in meaning since the Bible was translated. The Bible is really a textbook of metaphysics, a manual for the growth of the soul, and it looks at all questions from this point of view. It is impossible to emphasize this point too much. For this reason, it takes the broadest view of every subject. It sees all things in their relationship to the human soul and it uses many common terms in a far wider sense than that given to them by common use. For example, the word bread in the Bible means not merely any kind of physical food, which is the broadest interpretation that is put upon in general literature, but all things that man requires, all physical things, such as clothing, shelter, money, education, companionship, and so forth. And above all, it stands for spiritual things, such as spiritual perception, spiritual understanding, and preeminently, spiritual realization. Give us this day our daily bread. I am the bread of life. Unless ye eat this bread. Those last three statements were in quotes. Another example is the word prosperity. In the scriptural sense, prosperity and prosper signify a great deal more than the acquirement of material possessions. They really mean success in prayer. From this point of view of the soul, success in prayer is the only kind of prosperity worth having. And if our prayers are successful, we shall naturally have all the material things that we need. A certain quantity of material goods is essential on this plane, of course, but material wealth is really the least important thing in life. And this the Bible implies by giving the word prosperous its true meaning. To be poor in spirit does not in the least mean the thing we call poor-spirited nowadays. To be poor in spirit means to have emptied yourself of all desire to exercise personal self-will and, what is just as important, to have renounced all preconceived opinions in the wholehearted search for God. It means to be willing to set aside your present habits of thought, your present views and prejudices, your present way of life, if necessary, to jettison, in fact, anything and everything that can stand in the way of your finding God. One of the saddest passages in all literature is the story of the rich young man who missed one of the great opportunities of history and turned away sorrowful because he had great possessions. This is really the story of mankind in general. We reject the salvation that Jesus offers us, our chance of finding God because we have great possessions, not in the least because we are very rich in terms of money, for indeed most people are not, but because we have great possessions in the way of preconceived ideas, confidence in our own judgment, and in the ideas with which we happen to be familiar, spiritual pride born of academic distinction, sentimental or material attachment to institutions and organizations, habits of life that we have no desire to renounce, concern for human respect, or perhaps fear of public ridicule, or a vested interest in worldly honor and distinction. And these possessions keep us chained to the rock of suffering, that is our exile from God. The rich young man is one of the most tragic figures in history, not because he happened to be wealthy, for wealth itself is neither good nor bad, but because his heart was enslaved by the love of money, which Paul tells us is the root of all evil. He could have been a multimillionaire in gold, silver and gold, and as long as his heart was not set upon it, he would have been just as free as the poorest beggar to enter the kingdom of heaven. His trust, however, was in his riches, and this shut the gate. Why was not the Christ message received with acclaim by the ecclesiastics of Jerusalem? Because they had great possessions. Possessions of rabbinical learning, possessions of public honor and importance, authoritative offices as the official teachers of religion, and these possessions they would have had to sacrifice in order to accept the spiritual teaching. The humble and unlearned folk who heard the Master gladly were happy in having no such possessions to tempt them away from the truth. Why is it that in modern times, when the same simple Christ message of the immanence and availability of God and of the inner light that burns forever in the soul of man once more made its appearance in the world, it was again, for the most part, among the simple and unlettered that it was gladly received? Why was it not the bishops and deans and moderators and ministers and presbyteries who gave it to the world? Why was it not Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Heidelberg, the great broadcasting center for this most important of all knowledge? And again, the answer is because they had great possessions. Great possessions of intellectual and spiritual pride. Great possessions of self-satisfaction and cocksureness. Great possessions of academic commitment and of social prestige. The poor in spirit suffer from none of these embarrassments, either because they have never had them, or because they have risen above them on the tide of spiritual understanding. They have got rid of the love of money and property, the fear of public opinion, and of disapproval of relatives or friends. They are no longer overawed by human authority, however august. They are no longer cocksure in their own opinions. They have come to see that their most cherished beliefs may have been, and probably were, mistaken, and that all their ideas and views of life may be false and in need of recasting. They are ready to start again, and in that very beginning, they are ready to start again at the very beginning and learn life anew. So, that is the first beatitude reading by Emmet Fox. And I love this because it addresses so much in the front end, right? I'll reference the reading a couple more times, but there's some things that are established right in the beginning of this beatitude, which I think are very important to keep in mind as we go through this chapter of Sermon on the Mount, because it will come up regularly. And the first, he emphasizes that the terms used in the Bible when it was translated aren't necessarily what we commonly associate it with, and that also some of these words have just changed meaning. I think we'll see that more, even more so, and I think it's blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. I believe that's that beatitude, how it's phrased, but I think we'll learn more about that impact of the vocabulary change and the meaning change with the verbiage as we go through this. So keep this in mind, like when we're referencing this from these Bibles and things like that, like the English language has evolved and changed since it was written. So words that used to mean one thing don't mean the same thing, or the common perception of words aren't still that common perception, right? Like the understanding we have today isn't the understanding that was being used when it was initially written, right? And I also like in this, he says the Bible is a textbook for the growth of the soul. That's its purpose, right? We're supposed to grow in principle and understanding and grow closer to the God of our understanding. We're supposed to grow closer to that divine source, that Christ-like character, that righteousness, whatever you would call that power, or whatever you would call that entity you're in service to, which could be the highest potential a society could achieve if you're inclined to not necessarily subscribe to the God idea of in any form or nature. So this is a growth of your soul and of the nature of man towards a ideal and a perspective. And that's what the Bible is for, and that's what this chapter is about, and that's what the beatitudes are about. That's what the entire Sermon on the Mount is about, and also in, I think, Matthew chapter 5 is the term "as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he," right? Which is what James Allen's book "As a Man Thinketh" was purely based on. Was a extrapolation and a exploration of the furthest extent of that singular term, and it came to fruition with this amazing book that has changed the lives of millions. So just to keep that in mind, and I like how Emmet Fox brought in some very distinct examples, like the example of bread, right? It's today, it's pretty directly associated and commonly accepted that bread would indicate, physical sustenance of some sort, right? Like food, whatever. That's the common association, if not the literal association of just bread itself. But he says it's not just physical sustenance, food for the body, but it's everything the body might need, whether it's clothing, shelter, food, all these things, but also spiritual bread. And he references the Lord's Prayer, which is, I think, is very important to draw that, or to make that association. So give us this day our daily bread. So what we need physically and what we need mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all of these ways of living, right? So that's a great association for one term, and it's how expansive the term can be comparatively to what we think of now, and how limited really our perspective is, how narrowly we think about things today. And it's amazing how things have changed and how things have been shifted, and it almost needs a recalibration sometimes, it feels like. So, and then the other example he gave was prosperity, and most time that's associated with a physical, material, maybe it's immaterial, or a material wealth growth, a growth in material wealth. And he says it's not the truest form of prosperity. Yes, it means growth, but it means growth in spirit, right? It's growth of the soul through prayer in all forms. And that's a much different thing. It makes you wonder if sometimes the words have been intentionally misassociated to something materialistic, when in reality it had a much more vital term and much more spiritual association to it. And it's been kind of transformed into something that guides away instead of guides to this power and this God of our understanding. So, and it's important. It's interesting because he says if you succeed in prayer, if you're successful in prayer, if you prosper in prayer, so your soul is growing and you're growing nearer to that ideal that we talked about, everything else grows as well, right? Whether it's just materially or financially and everything else, but the more the soul grows, the prosperity in the rest of your life seems to be prevalent. So then after these examples, though, he dives in more into the poor in spirit actual beginning to this, which is interesting. Because when you hear poor in spirit, my common associations, what I would think, so I'll talk about my experience with it is, it sounds weak. It sounds like no backbone. It sounds like no confidence. It sounds like a miserable person almost. And he quickly addresses that it's not what we commonly associate. Here, let me look at the wording he used. It was, he stated, does not in the least mean the thing we call poor-spirited nowadays, right? So it's changed. That's one of the things that's changed. And to be poor in spirit, he specifically states, is to have emptied yourself of all desire to exercise personal self-will, and what is just as important, to have renounced all preconceived opinions in the wholehearted search for God. So we're saying here, to be poor in spirit, empty all desire to exercise personal self-will and to seek God's will. Right? So restated, it, in words that when I first read this resonated with me, and they still do today, is to have less of a will to serve myself and more of a will to serve God. So when we say poor in spirit, it's poor in my own personal spirit, my spirit of selfishness and self-centeredness, right? It's a poor in the spirit of to live in a self-serving only manner, and to be filled with a spirit of service to God and others focused spirit, right? So poor in spirit is poor in my own personal spirit, my selfishness and self-centeredness, and to be filled with the spirit of service, and to as effectively and as able as I possibly could perform God's will, which is really living a principled and virtuous life, which I've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. So he talks about the rich young man's story, and it's an important story, right? And he equates it to this is all mankind at one point. And I read another book by V.C. Kitchen, saying it was called I Was a Pagan. And he talks about all the different types of gods we can serve without knowing it, right? And what Emmet Fox is pointing to is the sacrifice of all of the false gods that we serve, right? Whether it's the love of money, or it's the love of self, it's the love of vanity, love of power, prestige, all of these things that we can worship instead of God. We can give a lot of lip service. We can give a lot of testimony that we are in service to God, but the reality is we are so attached to these things in our life, right? And when he talks about the rich young man's story, the problem in that story is not that the man was wealthy. It was that he was not willing to give up his wealth. Not to say that everybody that wants to live a Christ-like life has to be and live in abject poverty, but you cannot worship the wealth that you have. You cannot have this attachment to these things. You cannot define yourself by these things of this material world. The things of this material world, they come and they go, right? So I wanted to read the last paragraph on 22 here. Okay. He starts talking about possessions and multiple times, and I want to reread each time he does that. He says, and this is just after he introduced the rich young man story. He says, not in the least because we are very rich in terms of money, for indeed most people are not, but because we have great possessions in the way of preconceived ideas, confidence in our own judgment and the ideas with which we happen to be familiar, spiritual pride born of academic distinction, sentimental or material attachment to institutions and organizations, habits of life that we have no desire to renounce, concern for human respect or perhaps fear of public ridicule, or a vested interest in worldly honor and distinction. These are the possessions that keep us chained to the rock of suffering. That is our exile from God. These are the things that stand in the way, that hold us back from fully embracing the God of our understanding and living that righteous Christ-like life into that virtuous ideal that I've talked about on this podcast many times, right? So this rich young man story really is about not sacrificing the false gods we worship. That's what we're talking about here. He talks about how Paul said the love of money is the root of all evil, and that's selfishness and everything. And we're talking about getting rid of all attachment to this physical world. And when I say all attachments, all things we define ourselves by in this physical world, right? Like there's a movement today to really grab onto labels and identify to certain things and let ourselves be defined by certain qualities and fight for these definitions that we want to be associated with. And I think it's harming many people in a lot of ways that might not be evident right away, but will come to the surface eventually. And I like how he also just said in there, just to clarify it, that wealth is not a bad thing. It just cannot define you, right? So like, there's going to be people in here that say, what is it? The enter in the I don't know the actual biblical reference where it is, but it's easier for a camel to enter to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter in the kingdom of heaven, right? I think that's what it is, but money isn't the problem. It's our worship of it, our love of it, our desperate need of it to feel a sense of safety and security, right? So the next thing I want to talk about was the spiritual pride. He said spiritual pride in that, and I wanted to he gave a more in-depth perspective, because what does that mean? When I first read that, I had no clue, and I was just on my spiritual journey anyway. I just started learning about these things and how to live differently and why I should be living differently, and I hadn't had too many experiences as to why it was important to do so or what spiritual pride could be. So he talked about it here in that why was not the Christ message received with acclaim by the ecclesiastics of Jerusalem? Because they had great possessions. Right? So these religious people had great possessions of rabbinical learning, possessions of public honor and importance, authoritative offices as the official teachers of religion. And these possessions they would have had to sacrifice in order to accept the spiritual teaching. The humble and unlearned folks who heard the master gladly were happy to have no such possessions to tempt them away from the truth. So these people had positions of esteem in the community, especially the religious and spiritual communities. They had this respect and this honor and this dignity that they weren't willing to let go of. They needed to question anything outside of that, not because it questioned necessarily, not because the teachings were wrong, but more so it threatened their own position in society, in that pecking order of a community, right? It had the potential to devalue who they were. Actually, not the potential, it immediately was. So they couldn't let that go. The pride, they had to hold on to it, because that's what they defined themselves by. For them to have actually grown, they would have had to sacrifice those things they were holding on to so dearly. And so that's kind of that is a expansion on what spiritual pride can look like. So it just gives a little bit better perspective of that and some understanding, which I thought was important. And we need to realize that anything we draw value from in this world, anything, is an attachment that blocks us from God. It is how did he state it? The chain that keeps us, keeps us chained. It's the thing that keeps us chained to the rock of suffering that is the exile from God, right? So in other words, we keep ourselves away from God. That's the only thing. So it's and this includes physical possessions and possessions in the community, or standings in the community, associations to certain organizations, or spiritual pride, as we just talked about. And then there's another one that he talks about, intellectual pride, which is important as well. There's a lot of that going around right now. Excuse me, I kicked the tripod there. Let me see here. When he was talking about why this teaching isn't proclaimed by all these different religious sects, or why this teaching isn't taught and embraced by the scientific community. And this is where we talk about intellectual pride, the possessions of things. So we're talking about things people have and they possess and they want to hold on to, right? And this can be intellectual pride too. So he lists all those colleges and says the great broadcasting center for the most important of all knowledge. And again, the answer is because they had great possessions. Great possessions of intellectual and spiritual pride, great possessions of self-satisfaction and cocksureness, great possessions of academic commitment and of social prestige, right? So like they had a certain reputation in the academic community. They have a certain association to prestige and respect, right? So he's talking about, obviously later on, this is past the days of Jesus, but in new days, right? And with institutions that Emmet Fox believed, and I also believe, should recognize the power and potential that's been written into these pages for spiritual guidance and understanding and learning, right? So the embracing and the death grip they had on the beliefs that were already previously established, they would not let that go, right? Or some people hold on to their intellectual disbelief more passionately than people of religious denominations hold on to their spiritual beliefs, right? Like, it's a painful thing for some to let those things go. I thought that this was going to be a shorter episode for y'all, but it doesn't look that way. It's still going to end up being about 40 minutes. So, but these are the things we need to sacrifice in order to become closer to God, in order to have this virtuous, Christ-like, righteous character, this ideal that we should be striving for, that we need to learn is the ultimate goal. Those are the things that are blocking us. And he talks about the things that people have sacrificed to actually pursue this God of their understanding. They have gotten rid of the love of money and poverty, the fear of public opinion, and the disapproval of relatives or friends. They are no longer overawed by human authority, however august. August, by the way, means respected and impressive. Like, they reserve awe for their God only, and a human is merely a human. I had to look up August just so we're aware. They are no longer cocksure in their own opinions. They're willing to be wrong. They're not defined by the correctness of what they believe. There's many that are. That was me for a long time. They have come to see that their most cherished beliefs may have been and probably were mistaken, and that all their ideas and views of life may be false and in need of recasting. One of the most important things that I've ever heard one of the most important things I heard at the beginning of my sobriety and my recovery and my spiritual journey was, everything I knew as truth is up for review. I don't know where this person got it from, but that hit home for me. And that's what Emmet Fox is talking about on this, right? The views of life may be false and need of recasting. They are ready to start again at the very beginning and learn life anew, right? So this is when we talk about this is many people like myself, we've gone to the edges of who we are. We've gone to the edges of our humanness and our self-will and our ego, and we found the edges of ourselves, and we found that to be ineffective. We found that to be the edge of something that we thought was endless. And when we start to live this way, it's commonly said we were reborn. It's a rebirth. It's a rededication to a different way of life. You have to have the willingness to live differently to pursue this. He talked about having old behaviors we didn't want to renounce, all of these things. And, we have to let the old thoughts and old behaviors and old way of living go to make room for new things that can come in that are more aligned with this God. But I think the death of that ego, the realization that ego will always fail us, has to be learned by each individual. I guess I've had to learn it for myself anyway. I had to be completely defeated before I was willing to say I need to try it a different way. I was a very selfish and self-centered person and was doing things to serve myself only. I wasn't willing to be of service, truly. There was part of me that probably wanted to. I believe that, but I didn't think it was possible. So, anyway, that is the conclusion of that, right? That was the first beatitude in here. And the blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that means blessed are those who are poor in their own self-serving will and are willing to serve the God of their understanding, because that comes with all the blessings that the kingdom of heaven holds for them. Peace, serenity, love, steadfastness, strength, surety, faith, courage, integrity, forgiveness. All of these amazing qualities that we want in our lives and we try to obtain, but we fail to get, are achieved through being poor in our self-serving nature and being willing to serve a God we might be scared of. So, thank you all for joining me. I'm looking forward to doing the rest of this chapter, the rest of the Beatitudes. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and please let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll be back again with the next one. So, until next time, thanks.